Let me introduce our keynote speaker. We're very privileged to have Alan Donnelly here with us. He's the Executive Chairman of Sovereign Sustainability and Development, and he's the convener of the G7 and the G20 Health and Development Partnerships. And he's someone who's been around the political world for a long time. So we have someone who's been an insider, who has the inside track in all those rooms where the decisions get made. So we will benefit from his advice and his insight about how do we reach the right places with the right messages at the right time so we can achieve change. Alan, please, the floor is yours.
So today I've walked, I've acted for 5 minutes there. It's fantastic. I'm going to have to talk to my staff about us doing this every day when we're back at our headquarters in London. But I'm delighted to be here. And I really came at the invitation of Neil, who I got to know during the work that we did in developing a new initiative together with Novartis on trying to promote a new way of looking at cardiovascular disease and how we try to get governments active in this space. As you've heard from Tamsin, I chair the G20 and G7 Health and Development Partnership, which is a not-for-profit organisation set up during the time when Angela Merkel presided over the German G20 in 2017. And I don't know whether you're aware of this, but health never used to be discussed at a G20 level. The G20 was there very much to look at the consequences of the economic downturn that occurred in 2008 and 2009. But Angela Merkel, being a scientist, decided that she wanted to have health ministers together and to have, as a legacy initiative, she wanted to have an organisation that brought together the private sector, the voluntary sector, the not-for-profit sector and academia. And so the G20, G7 Health and Development Partnership was born out of that. And now it's got over 30 global partners, and each one of those partners is a partnership itself. And so globally, there are about 10,000 organizations associated with the G20, G7 Health and Development Partnership. And the aim is to try and keep health at the top of the political agenda. And just one aside, which I think it just shows you how prescient this initiative was by the Chancellor of Germany. She, at the first meeting of health ministers, had a role-play exercise for the health ministers on pandemic preparedness and how to cope with an airborne pandemic. And what emerged from that session in Berlin was that virtually every country present at the G20 was ill-prepared. And sadly, of course, as we know, when we ran into 2020, they did very little further between 2017 and 2020 to learn any lessons from that session. I think one of the key things to say to you, and soon I'm going to get onto some of the detail of how we conduct our advocacy within this partnership, and how, when I was the British Labour Party leader in the European Parliament, how I used to respond to advocates, because it's very important that you get this right. And we very much want to help you with this, by the way. But the key thing here is that we've got to try and keep health in all of its dimensions at the top of the agenda, whether it's the G7 or the G20. But it isn't only with health ministers. I meet ministers all the time, and I'm off to Paris tonight. There's the Paris Peace Forum tomorrow, where there'll be a lot of ministers there, and there's a special session on health system resilience. But it's not health ministers that only have to be targeted, particularly in relation to cardiovascular disease and the other non-communicable diseases. We have to tackle, and we've got to have a dialogue with heads of government, but most importantly with finance ministers, because they are the block. And as many of you will know, that in most countries, in terms of the pecking order, the finance minister comes significantly above the health minister in terms of political firepower. And one of the things we did through this partnership was to ask the late Prime Minister Abe, back in 2018, to have a first meeting of health and finance ministers under the G20. And Japan have always been fantastic in their leadership, either in the G7 or the G20, when it comes to putting health on the political agenda. And Abe agreed to do that. And so we had in 2019, during the G20 presidency, the first ever meeting of health and finance ministers. And this was pre-pandemic. And then, of course, once the pandemic hit, it was essential then that health ministers and finance ministers, and by the way, also central bank governors, were involved in a joint dialogue about how to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. So the whole dynamic in terms of health at a multilateral level is quite a recent phenomenon, frankly, and it was very much started by the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Now, one of the things that, and I'm just going to refer to my notes here, so I'm putting the glasses on. One of the things that is disappointing for me, and I'm sure it is for you, is that when we agreed the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the goals on non-communicable diseases was to reduce premature death by a third by 2030. And even before the pandemic, things were slowing down. They were moving in the wrong direction. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and as you know, for many people, there was no diagnosis for cancer, for heart disease, because of the pressures on on national health services. And since the end of, or the relative end of COVID, if we can put it that way, things are slowing down again. And so, as things stand at the moment, there's no way in which we are going to meet the Sustainable Development Goal on reducing premature deaths by 2030. And I think that's a real disappointment. It's the crippling impact, socio-economic impact of cardiovascular disease in particular is deeply concerning. And last night I was speaking with Linda from Australia, who has created an initiative called Her Heart. Linda, I think that's right, isn't it? And she was telling me that in Australia today, on average, a woman dies every hour from cardiovascular disease in an advanced economy like Australia. And of course, what she explained to me, which I wasn't aware, and I can tell you this has never come up in any of the meetings that we've had with ministers in recent years, is the difference for cardiovascular disease in women when it comes to diagnosis compared to men. And so, you know, there are layers in this whole CVD debate, which I can tell you are not being properly addressed at the moment. Now, the way that the ministerial meetings operate, next year there will be Brazil presiding over the G20, and the Italians will be presiding over the G7, and I'm with the Italian Sherpas next week, and had meetings recently with the Brazilian Sherpas. And the way it operates in terms of the health track is there are preliminary meetings called, it's basically the health working group. And normally it's the chief medical officer from each of the countries who meet to Sherpa the preparations for the meeting. And so one of the things we've done through the G20, G7 Health and Development Partnership is we've targeted those health working groups, because what we've tried to do is we've tried to influence the way in which those preparatory meetings shape the draft conclusions for the ministers themselves. And equally, we work closely with those who are sherping the joint health and finance ministers, because that still happens. Those meetings still take place. But we've and I think some of my staff will be watching this, or will see it. We just did a survey of the solemn declarations that have come from health ministers, joint health and finance ministers, heads of government in meetings of the OECD, the World Health Assembly, annually in Geneva, the G20, the G7, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. It's called CHOGM, which is held every few years, which is 56 countries, and also the UN General Assembly. And there are lots of content where heads of government have signed up and ministers have signed up to, in their solemn declarations, in the need to act on non-communicable diseases. And the reason why they've done it is they have seen the evidence of the impact on their communities. And where, as you know, where in the past it was something that was very much addressed in the context of richer nations, this is now a global pandemic impacting low and middle and rich countries alike. And so it's not that the evidence hasn't been provided. I'm sure yesterday, looking at your program, you talked at some length at the evidence that there is about cardiovascular disease. But the impact it has on communities and the impact it has on the economy is massive. And what we've tried to do through the G20, G7 Health and Development Partnership is we've tried to measure, we've tried to work on metrics to measure the impact of investing in health. And there's a lot of work being done by the World Economic Forum on this, and the World Health Organization and the OECD. And one of the things we have to do in this initiative that you're involved in your manifesto and your ongoing collaborative work together, is you need absolutely bomb-proof statistics on, and there are lots of health economists out there who would be willing to help you, and there are probably some in this room who could do this. But you need examples. As the moderator said earlier, we need concrete examples of what is the impact of investing €1 to tackle cardiovascular disease. And I can tell you, no government, and I say this as a former politician, I don't know of any government that has lost an election because it's invested in health. They win elections because they invest in health. And what they need to be able to do is they need to show that they're not just spending. I mean, in Britain, we talk, there's always a news story about, oh, look at the spending in the National Health Service. It's not about spending, it's about strategically investing in healthcare. And that's true whether it's in cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, antimicrobial resistance, or pandemic preparedness. And so what's the role that you can play here? Well, again, just going back to my days in Parliament, if I was approached, or if there was a request to meet me, and it was from a patient group, it might be on a very particular disease that might be quite limited to a small number of people, I would always meet them. If it was a group of people on things like industrial diseases, like asbestosis and so forth, I always met them. And the reason for that is politicians are incredibly sensitive to patient groups, because your advocacy in their constituency can be incredibly influential, particularly now with the use of social media. So one of the reasons I wanted to be here today, as well as the fact that Neil had invited me, is because I really want us to help you, and I really want you to think about how you can be involved in a long-term coordinated campaign to influence your city leaders, your local members of parliament, and of course your ministers. Now, I know some of you will think, oh, well, no one's going to take notice. Believe me, they will take notice, provided you're using the right information and the right tools. And I just want to come on to this. And one other thing, next year we've got the European parliamentary elections. We've got an election in Britain. We've got the election in the United States. I think there's an election in Mexico. There's a lot of activity going on at the moment. And there's an opportunity in terms of the G20, particularly in the G7, to be talking to governments and parliamentarians about this whole issue of cardiovascular disease. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the way in which I would approach the advocacy if we were working with you. The first thing is, can I just ask you, how many of you in the room are clinicians? Okay. Now, or scientists? Okay. Now, when we started down this route of the G20 partnership, when it was created in 2017, my team went out to a whole range of organizations, including Imperial College, Harvard, the London School of Tropical Medicine, PATH, which is a big initiative on technology and health, whole range of organizations. And we asked them to put into 2 pages of A4 with one headline, how do they make a difference? How are they making a difference? And I have to say that the people who were asked to write it, and my brother used to be the chief scientist at Unilever, so I know how hardwired scientists can be. But the thing is, they couldn't do it. They could not put into 2 pages what difference they were making through the initiatives they were taking on health. And so the first thing we had to do with all of those partners was to sit down with them and say, look, if you're trying to influence an Alan Donnelly who sits on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, I'm not a health expert, I'm an economic and monetary policy person, he is not going to understand about new molecules and so forth. You've got to be able to talk to him in a language that he understands. And so one of the critical things was to simplify, and I don't mean dumb down, but to simplify the headline message, but with the evidence still there, because you've got to have the evidence. The evidence has to be strong, but the messaging for politicians, whether it's city leaders or whether it's members of parliament or ministers, the headline has to grab them, and they've got to understand it. And politicians tend to be hardwired in a way that they speak in sound bites anyway, so they quite like headlines. They like to see the headlines. So the mantra that you get on this issue, if you're going to take forward your manifesto, is absolutely critical. And you've got to work out what are the headlines. And every organization that is associated with the hub is going to have to agree that when you're speaking to these people, there will be at least some common headline themes which you're all using and which you're using in social media. And part of it is about just the scale of the burden of CVD. And of course, part of it is the economic burden. And the other thing is, what is the impact of investing relatively small sums of money in tackling this issue? I said it has to be evidence-based. And that's critical because for finance ministers, they like to kick the tires on everything to make sure that it actually stands up to scrutiny. No one wants to be investing in an initiative which is not absolutely soundly based. But the one thing I know from the work I've done with Neil is all the evidence is there when it comes to cardiovascular disease. Tamsin mentioned concrete examples. The thing that influences politicians the most is if you can give them an example. And I'll go back to Linda's example, because we were talking last night about it. If you go to women politicians and you talk about these differences for women who may be misdiagnosed or undiagnosed with CVD, and you talk about the number of people who die, you get their attention. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment on women's health in the G20 and the G7. And that's a really interesting area of policy for the Brazilians and for the Italians next year. The European Union are also looking at it. So concrete examples, and they don't have to be national examples. They can be local examples where you might have done it in your local town or village or your local community, but where it's had a tangible impact. And those sort of things are incredibly valuable when you're talking particularly to city leaders and to local politicians. In your manifesto, which I've looked at, and I think it's a very helpful document, the WHO, in addition, has also produced its Best Buys document, if you go onto their website. And it's very simple things that governments can do on things like tobacco use, alcohol use, the lack of exercise, excuse me, and also then the treatment of CVD. And so have a look at the Best Buys part of the WHO's website, because they support what you're saying and they provide a lot of evidence in that. And then, of course, results. So what is the consequence of investing in better and earlier diagnosis and investing resources in it? But equally, what is the consequence of not investing in it? And one of the arguments I've used last year with the Indonesian government when they had the presidency of the G20, I said to their health minister, the meetings were held on the island of Bali, and I drove with him from some meeting we'd had, and I was in his car, and we drove into the Hilton Hotel where the main ministerial meetings were being held. And as we drove along, all the hoardings outside the conference were for tobacco. And I said to him, I said, Minister, you've got to get rid of this. And he said, they fund sport, and they fund culture, and of course they pay their tax. And he said, it's just very, very difficult. And the point is, we've got to show people like that. And he's a very honourable person, but he just felt overwhelmed by the fact that the tobacco industry had such a grip on their country. But you will have examples of where you, either in your country or in your community, you've disconnected the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry from what goes on in society, and it has results. And then in terms of the decision makers, well, next week it's the London Global Cancer Week, and we'll have the City Cancer Initiative people at the event. And they've made an enormous amount of progress through city initiatives. And in my professional work, not in the work that I do for this not-for-profit initiative, I work for Michael Bloomberg. I've worked for him for 23 years. I'm going to stop in a second so you can get on. And he's run a campaign within cities to deal with things like sustainability and health. And what we've got to do is we've got to try and make sure that we look at those. So very quickly, timely national parliamentary contacts. We have all party groups in Britain and in Brussels. There's the supranational institutions like the African Union now, which is doing a fantastic job, and the multilateral organizations. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, I beg your pardon. And the multilateral organizations like the G20, G7. There's also the multilateral development banks. The European Investment Bank is the biggest multilateral development bank in the world. They've got a vast health agenda. So does the Islamic Development Bank, and I was with them 2 weeks ago in Riyadh. And you've got to be talking to the organizations who can really make a decision, can really make a change. And then finally on the messengers, well, I do think there's a critical role for you as patient networks to play an important role here. And you also need high-profile influencers. One of my previous existences, I used to be the global ambassador for Formula One racing, and there was a big problem with young men not wearing seatbelts. Biggest cause of death amongst young men under the age of 30 is not wearing seatbelts in cars. And so Michael Schumacher, who was the champion at the time, we ran a big campaign, particularly in Latin America, and the death rate fell because young people were doing it. You must have influencers who are involved in your campaign. And then, of course, strategic public and private partnerships. And then finally, sharing the success. When you get a member of parliament or a city leader to take an action which produces a concrete result, then you've got to allow them to share in the success. You've got to say that without their help, this would not have happened. And what you find is that encourages others to take place. So this is a really important initiative you're involved in. Neil, I commend it very strongly. We're very happy to help you collectively as you go through this journey. I know many of you have been doing it for a lot of years, but if we don't do this, the socio-economic long-term damage that will be done to our global economy and to our population is going to be immeasurable. And that's why we need this coordinated action now and why your manifesto is so important. Thank you.
Just stay there for 5 minutes Q&A.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Alan, because you really helped set the scene for us. Because you highlighted that there are all of these conversations, and politicians do care about health, and there are ministerial meetings happening all over the place. But the challenge is for advocates to understand how do they get the message through so it can be received. So that was really helpful to give that insight. We've got room for probably 1 or 2 questions. Is there anything you would like to ask Alan, get his advice? James has got a hand up here. Let me give our patient advocates a chance. If you've got a question, now is your chance. Yes, please go ahead.
Is this one working? Yes.
It is.
Alan, thanks very much for your talk there. It was really illustrative of the way in which organisations can advocate across the board in health, but obviously specifically with cardiovascular health. Right at the start of your talk, you mentioned the issue of women's cardiovascular health and the fact that there were gaps in your knowledge. And that's obviously something that I think is really important to get across to a whole range of politicians. But patient organisations can do that. They can offer you that level of advice. My question is about the individual, non-affiliated advocate. What advice would you give to someone like me who doesn't belong to an organisation but believes passionately in advocating for cardiovascular health, but as an individual?
I think because of social media now, individuals are incredibly powerful, and most politicians will have at least one person in their organisation that will be looking at social media from its widest sense. And so the thing is that if you're in a constituency, my old constituency was the northeast of England. If you're in the northeast of England and you write to Alan Donnelly as the member of the European Parliament and you post it on social media, then I can guarantee that as an individual, it will have an impact and other people pick it up. So even if you're not affiliated to one of the networks, I still think you can be incredibly impactful.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for your advice. But Europe and many of the developed countries have high levels of democracy. What would be your advice to influence governments, populist governments, who really don't like criticism, they don't like proposals, they run the country as a dictatorship. So in breaking this barrier, I would really appreciate how we, as patient advocacy, can break these barriers that exist.
Well, the one that comes to mind for me is some of the countries that we've dealt with in Africa, where some of those countries have a very tenuous relationship with proper democracy. But what we've tended to do in those circumstances is we've used the African Union, which now has a Centre for Disease Control. It's developing its own mechanism for its own medicines agency. And so what we've done, and we do the same with GCC countries in the Middle East, although I have to say Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait and Bahrain and Qatar on health really do invest heavily, by the way, in their domestic population. But what we tend to do is we will target the regional agency, the regional organization, because that can they can convene the countries that may not be, where you may not be able to get traction with a particular minister. And it's the African Union only joined the G20 this year, after many of us have been lobbying for many years for Africa to be brought in the same way that the EU is a full member of the G20, but they're there. And so I think for the African continent, there's a real chance to be able to do something. In relation to China, we've got very good links through this initiative with the Chinese Health Ministry. And we work, I mean, it's a different type of work process, but we do work with them and we do share our conclusions with them. So you've just got to find the level at which you can try and exert as much pressure as possible if it's not a traditional democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one last question.
Alan, thank you so much for that. My name is Mark Baines. I'm the co-founder of the HeartLife Foundation in Canada. Just before I ask my question to the first speaker as an individual advocate, HeartLife, for instance, we're a smaller group in Canada, but we joined forces with Ed Harden at the front there with the Health Policy Partnership. Ed's been able to bring together multiple groups to really amplify our voices on policy change. So that's one recommendation is power of the people, right? And so, yep. I mean, I encourage a discussion with Ed and the importance of the group that he's working with. Alan, fantastic conversation. I think I could listen to you for hours. HeartLife recently launched a heart failure policy framework in Canada, just last week, focused on 3 pillars, which aligns with the manifesto. We're constantly competing with other health conditions that are going to ministers to say, how can we promote this through policy? We're working through different levels of bureaucracy with the Canadian Cardiovascular Society. How can an advocacy group like ours work through that bureaucracy and make our way and get the attention of ministers? I know you mentioned some of this, but really as a smaller group competing with much larger groups with much more resources, what do you advise?
Well, first of all, I think Canada does an extraordinary job on many of the big health challenges that the world faces today. And we're working at the moment with the Canadian government on antimicrobial resistance because they have a national plan for AMR. I think you shouldn't, I'm from the northeast of England, we have an expression that shy children get nout, they get nothing. And the thing is, shy bairns get nout. And what you've got to do is it's extraordinary that you can be a small organization. We started this partnership off with less than 10 partners, tiny budget, but we got Prime Minister Abe to understand the reason for having a joint health and finance ministers. And so I don't think it's the size or the sophistication or the funding of the organization. You've got to be flexible, and often smaller organizations can be much more flexible in how they approach things. And it's also about your ideas. If you've got innovative ideas, which might be based on conversations that you've had with other organizations in this room, you can take them to the various organizations in Canada. But I have to say that I find Canada is much more open to a conversation than many governments are. But the size of your organization or the funding doesn't matter. It's how innovative you are, and it's your use of social media, and it's how persistent you are. One final thing on this. One of the things I've talked to Dr. Tedros about this, the head of the WHO. One of the things I'm a bit skeptical of is, we have the Global Day for Sepsis, and we have the Global Day, the Patient Safety Day, and we have this and global days, and I think they've become, to a large extent, rather, I'm afraid to say it, but a bit cosmetic. It's ticking a box. You know, we lit up the British Parliament yellow or orange for Patient Safety Day. Well, you know, fine, but is it going to make patients any safer? So I'm much more interested in concrete actions and outcomes. And if you're dealing with ministers or you're dealing with members of Parliament, for example, you have a health committee in your Parliament, they will want to talk to you if you've got something very concrete to say.